Level 1. The Backyard Beginner. You're 13 years old, and the knife is a cheap fixed blade you bought online for $18 because the one you actually wanted was $90. It has a plastic handle, a full tang you're not even sure is real, and an edge that came dull out of the box. To everyone else, it's a toy. To you, it's the first tool you've ever owned that wasn't handed to you. Your backyard isn't wilderness. It's a strip of grass behind your parents' house with a fence on 3 sides, and a neighbor who watches you a little too closely. You don't care. You drag out an old tarp from the garage, some paracord from a hardware store, and you start. Before we go further, if you've ever wondered whether you'd actually survive out there with nothing but a knife and your hands, hit subscribe and drop a like right now, because by the end of this, you'll know exactly where you'd land on this list. Alright, back to the beginning. You watch videos on a phone propped against a rock. You try to strike a ferro rod for the first time and nothing happens. You're holding it wrong. You're pushing the striker instead of pulling it. 40 minutes in, you finally get a spark to land in a tender bundle of dry grass and cotton balls smeared with petroleum jelly, and it catches. It's the smallest fire you've ever seen, and it means more to you than anything you've built with your hands before. You do it again the next day, and the day after that. Your dad asks if you're planning on burning the fence down. You are not. You're learning that fire isn't magic. It's oxygen, fuel, and heat arranged correctly. And once you understand the arrangement, you can make it happen almost anywhere. You sharpen the knife for the first time using a cheap 2-sided stone your uncle left behind. You do it wrong, rounding the edge instead of setting a consistent angle. And it takes you 3 attempts spread across a week before the blade actually holds an edge instead of just looking sharp. You learn to baton small pieces of kindling with it, splitting wood by hammering the spine of the knife through with a stick instead of swinging the blade. Because a video told you that's how you avoid breaking a cheap knife on the first month you own it. It works. The knife survives. You start collecting little scraps of knowledge like this, half-remembered rules from strangers on the internet that only become real once you've tested them yourself against wood and fire and your own impatience. This is how it starts for every bushcrafter who ever amounted to anything. Not in the woods, in a backyard with a dull knife and the fence on 3 sides. Level 2. The Weekend Camper. You're 15 now, and the backyard isn't enough anymore. You convince your parents to drop you at a state park for the day with a day pack you assembled from things you found around the house. You learn quickly that the woods don't care how confident you were on YouTube. You try to build a lean-to shelter using your tarp and some deadfall branches, and it collapses twice before you figure out the ridgeline needs to be tensioned properly, and the pitch of the roof needs to be steeper than you think. It rains that afternoon. 30 minutes of real rain, and your shelter holds on the 3rd attempt. You sit under it, dry, listening to water hit nylon instead of your head, and you understand something that no video fully explained: the difference between knowing a technique and having tested it against weather that doesn't negotiate. You start carrying a small water filter, the pump kind, because you read too many stories about Giardia to trust a stream without one. You practice on a creek that's probably clean anyway, just to build the habit. You learn to read a topographic map badly, then less badly. You get turned around once, only for 20 minutes, but 20 minutes of not knowing which direction the trailhead is teaches you more about navigation than an hour of reading about it ever could. You buy a compass. You learn to take a bearing. The panic from that 20 minutes becomes a permanent kind of respect for terrain that never leaves you. You also start paying attention to knots, real knots, not the granny knots you tied as a kid pretending to be a sailor, a clove hitch to anchor your tarp corners, a trucker's hitch to tension a ridgeline until it's drum tight, a bowline that won't slip under load. You practice them first at home on a chair leg, over and over, until your hands know the sequence without your eyes checking. The first time you tie a trucker's hitch correctly in the field, under a tarp, in the wind, you feel disproportionately proud of something that takes 8 seconds. Level 3. The Overnighter. You're 17 and you talk your way into your first solo night in the woods, a state forest 40 minutes from home, with a permit and a check-in time your mom insists on. You build a debris hut this time, not a tarp shelter, a real one. Insulation stacked knee-deep because you read that the debris hut is what gets people through cold nights when synthetic gear fails. You spend 4 hours gathering leaves and pine boughs. You underestimate how much you need. The first 2 hours of the night, you're cold, properly cold, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you there. You get up, gather more debris in the dark with a headlamp, and rebuild the insulation layer around yourself. You sleep in fragments after that, but you sleep, and you wake up at dawn having survived something you weren't sure you could. You try foraging for the first time on this trip. Wild greens you're 80% sure you identified correctly using a guidebook. Your stomach disagrees with your identification skills for about 6 uncomfortable hours the next day. It's not dangerous, just miserable, and it teaches you the rule every forager eventually learns the hard way. 80% sure is not a percentage you eat on. You start carrying 2 guidebooks instead of 1 and cross-referencing everything. This is the moment bushcraft stops being a hobby you dabble in and becomes a discipline you respect. You also cook your first real meal over an open fire on this trip. Not marshmallows, an actual dinner. Rice and dehydrated vegetables in a battered steel pot, balanced on 2 flat rocks over coals you built specifically for cooking, rather than warmth and light. You burn the bottom slightly because you don't yet understand that cooking coals need to be spread and managed differently than a blazing fire meant for light and heat. You eat it anyway. It's the best thing you've ever tasted, mostly because you made every part of the process happen yourself, from the spark to the plate. Level 4. The Competent Woodsman. You're 20 and the trips are multi-day now, 3 and 4 nights, deep enough into public land that you see nobody else for the duration. You've moved past shelter and fire into the skills that separate people who camp from people who can actually be dropped somewhere and function. You learn to set snares, legally, on land where it's permitted, not because you need the calories, but because understanding trapping mechanics teaches you how animals move through terrain, which teaches you how to read tracks, which teaches you how to read the entire landscape as a system of cause and effect instead of scenery. You find a game trail and follow it for 2 hours just to understand where it leads and why. You navigate this trip entirely without GPS. Map and compass only, because you promised yourself you would. You're off by half a kilometer at your first checkpoint. You correct it, recalculate your pace count, and hit the second checkpoint almost exactly. Small margin, but it's the margin that matters. Your pack is lighter than it was 2 years ago because you've learned that most of what beginners carry is fear disguised as preparation. You know which 10 items actually matter. Everything else stays home. You attend your first bushcraft meetup around this time, a gathering of maybe 30 people in a wooded county park who take this seriously in a way your friends never understood. Someone shows you a bow drill setup and it takes you 2 hours of failed attempts, blistered palms, and 1 small ember that dies before it catches, before you finally get a coal on your own. The community teaches you things solo practice can't. Someone corrects your feather stick technique with 1 sentence that saves you years of inefficient batoning. Someone else shows you a tarp configuration you'd never have thought of. The knowledge moves faster through people than through videos, and you start to understand why every serious practitioner eventually finds their way to a community like this. You also learn, at that same meetup, that the culture has its own quiet hierarchy. Nobody brags about their gear. The people who talk the least about what they own are usually the ones who can do the most with the least of it. You watch a 60-year-old man start a fire with 2 pieces of wood and a shoelace-thin bootlace in under 6 minutes while barely speaking. And you understand that this is the actual standard you're being measured against, not the confident narration of the videos you grew up watching. Level 5. The known name. You're 23, and people at meetups know who you are now. Not famous, known. You started filming your trips a year ago on a cheap action camera clipped to your pack strap, mostly so you could review your own technique, and a few hundred people started watching. Your bow drill success rate climbs from 1 coal in 5 attempts to nearly every time, because you've refined the bearing block, the spindle wood selection, the exact downward pressure that used to be guesswork and is now muscle memory. You start flint knapping, badly at first, cutting your hand twice before you understand platform angles well enough to strike consistent flakes. You make your first usable stone tool after 11 attempts. It's not sharp enough for much, but you made it from a rock in your own hands, and that changes something in how you see the entire natural world around you. You start teaching beginners at meetups the way you were taught, correcting one thing at a time, never overwhelming someone with everything wrong with their fire lay at once. You realize teaching is a different skill than doing. Doing is muscle memory. Teaching is finding the exact word that makes someone else's hands understand what yours already know. A 12-year-old at one of these gatherings gets his first call because of a single sentence you say about angle and pressure, and the look on his face reminds you of the exact moment in your own backyard that started all of this. Level 6, the Wilderness Guide. You're 27 and you've turned this into a profession. You complete your Wilderness First Responder certification, 80 hours of training on trauma, hypothermia, wilderness evacuation decisions, because you realize that leading other people into the backcountry means their safety is now a professional responsibility, not a personal risk you're choosing for yourself. You get hired by an outfitter to lead multi-day courses for clients who've never spent a night outside a hotel. Teaching strangers is different from teaching a friend at a meetup. Some clients panic the first time it rains through their tarp. Some refuse to eat anything you foraged, no matter how many times you explain the identification process. You learn patience as a technical skill, not just a personality trait. Your first real test comes on a 5-day course when a client twists an ankle 6 kilometers from the nearest trailhead. You stabilize it, build a hasty splint from a sleeping pad and cord, and make the call to evacuate slowly rather than push the group's original itinerary. It takes 11 hours instead of 2. Nobody else gets hurt. The client sends you a message a month later thanking you for staying calm. You don't tell them you weren't entirely calm. You just didn't let it show, because showing it wouldn't have helped anyone. You also notice how much of guiding is invisible labor, scouting water sources 2 days ahead of a group's arrival, checking weather models obsessively the night before departure, packing a repair kit heavy enough to fix 6 different pieces of gear that aren't even yours. Nobody sees this work. They only see the parts where you're calm around the fire, explaining how to read a cloud formation. And that's exactly how it's supposed to look. Level 7, the Expedition Leader. You're 32, and the trips have scaled into something else entirely. 10-day expeditions into terrain most people will never see. Subarctic forests one season, high desert the next. You're managing group dynamics, resupply logistics, weather windows that can close in hours, and the accumulated fatigue of people who thought they were prepared and weren't. On a subarctic trip, a sudden temperature drop catches one client without adequate layering, and you recognize the early signs of hypothermia, the slurred speech, the stumbling, before he recognizes them himself. You get him into dry insulation and the shelter within 20 minutes. It's close enough that you don't tell the rest of the group how close it was until much later. Your own skills have become close to automatic by now. You build a shelter in the dark without needing light to see your hands. You read weather in cloud formation and wind shift hours before it arrives. Your name starts circulating beyond your immediate region. Other guides ask your advice on route planning through terrain you've covered that they haven't. You also start turning down trips for the first time in your career, groups whose stated experience level doesn't match the terrain they're requesting, because you've learned that the cost of being wrong about that mismatch is measured in things far worse than a bad review. Level 8, the Legend. You're 38, and you attempt something you've been planning for 3 years, a solo expedition of 30 days into genuine wilderness with nothing but a knife, a ferro rod, and the clothes on your back. No resupply, no support team checking in. Document it for a long-form series that reaches people who've never heard of bushcraft as a discipline. You build your shelter on day 1. You establish a water source by day 2. The first real test comes on day 9 when a week of rain saturates every piece of debris insulation you've gathered, and your shelter, built for dry conditions, fails to keep pace with the moisture. You rebuild it entirely on day 10, this time accounting for drainage and ventilation you'd underestimated. It holds for the remaining 20 days through worse weather than the first failure. You take your first animal on day 14 from a snare line you set on day 3, and processing it teaches you something no theoretical study ever could about the actual cost of subsistence, the time, the waste, the respect it demands. By day 20, the isolation starts working on you in ways the physical hardship never did. You talk to yourself out loud just to hear a human voice. You catch yourself narrating tasks you've done automatically for 20 years, the way you once narrated them for a camera. Except now, there's no camera, just the habit of needing to hear the plan said out loud. By day 30, you've lost 8 kilos and gained something harder to measure. The footage becomes a documentary segment watched by millions of people who will never spend the night outside a house. And for many of them, it's the first time they understand that these skills are not costume. They're a discipline built from thousands of small failures compounding into competence. Level 9. The legacy. You're 45, and you run a bushcraft school now. 3 instructors under you, a property with 40 acres where you teach everything from your own 13-year-old backyard fire to skills most people will never need, but a few will need desperately someday. You've trained 2 of your instructors from complete beginners who could barely strike a ferro rod, and watching them teach it better than you did at their age is the most satisfying part of the entire operation. Your knees ache from decades of kneeling over fire lays. Your hands are scarred from batoning accidents and napping mistakes you've long since stopped making. Your relationships have absorbed the cost of the months you've spent away, and you don't pretend otherwise. The business side turns out to be harder than any night you ever spent cold in the woods. Insurance for a wilderness school is expensive and complicated. Liability waivers, land use permits, equipment that needs replacing every season because clients are harder on gear than you ever were on your own. You solve these problems the same methodical way you once solved the collapsing shelter, one variable at a time, refusing to accept that a problem has no solution just because it isn't a technical one. You still go out alone sometimes, not to teach, not to film, just to sit under a shelter you built with your own hands and remember what it felt like the first time a spark caught in a bundle of dry grass in a backyard with a fence on 3 sides. The distance between that moment and this one is difficult to calculate, but the logic connecting them is simple. Every failed fire taught you something a successful one couldn't. Every cold night taught you more than a warm one ever would. And somewhere right now, a 13-year-old is standing in a backyard with a cheap knife and a ferro rod they don't know how to use yet, striking it wrong, pushing instead of pulling, wondering why nothing happens. They're going to figure it out. Most do. Some of them will reach the level you reached. A few of them will go further, because they'll learn what you learned, but they'll also learn what you didn't. That's how it's supposed to work.